This is the Dallas Morning News. This episode is from an independent podcast hosted by the Dallas Morning News opinion team.
Well, Ken Hersh may not be as familiar to a lot of people, but I will tell you, looking at his background of building an enormously successful business, kind of the entrepreneurial piece, understanding of energy and public policy related to energy, and then talking about why he signed on to head up the Bush Center for the last 9 years. That was a fascinating story to me.
A wealth of experience. Ken really is actually a pioneer in energy private equity, which I learned that today. That was back when private equity may not have really existed in the mid-'80s, but Ken signed up to do something different and really told some great stories.
And an entrepreneur that got into a business, didn't know a lot about it, and basically out of just resilience and personal perseverance, really made a difference.
Well, he talks a lot about being a liberal arts major with an MBA attached to it. And so I think that's emblematic of who he is, and I think totally worth a listen.
I think it was a good story.
Welcome to Intersections, where we take a multi-generational look at the critical issues facing America. Tom, today's going to be fun.
Ken Hersh, what I would call an energy entrepreneur, highly successful in building a company with enormous wealth, but more important than that, influence in a lot of different markets, and who after that experience then went on to head the Bush Center. So we're going to have a fun conversation talking about that experiences, as well as someone that can articulate the whole realm of energy policy in America.
And before we start, do you remember when you and I first met?
Was it with your business plan?
It was with the business plan, and I was an intern at the Bush Center. And you graciously,
That's right.
You graciously allowed me to come up and meet with you for 30 minutes before I started my company. So just want to say thank you for that.
You gave me the opportunity to invest, and I didn't do it. So forgive me.
There you go. You're good. Okay, so we're going to start off. We're going to kind of go general for a second, and then we'll go deep. You've done a lot of things. You started a company, I think, at the age of 25, which became in GP. Well, you may start in college, but 25 was a critical moment. Richard Rainwater was a mentor, and GP becomes incredibly successful. You invest in energy transfer partners, et cetera. Look back over the last 3 to 4 decades. Give us some moments that stand out. Give us an idea.
Oh, God. Summarize 30 years in 30 seconds? Not possible. It was, in many ways, it was defining for me. And probably the single most exciting thing about it was when we got started in 1988, there was no such thing as the private equity industry. Those words didn't exist. We call ourselves a partnership with a partner. We loosely use the term fund, but it was not a common phrase. And we were just making it up as we went along. And we had a single partner who ultimately went bankrupt, so we had to find other partners. And then when we used their money and invested it before we were able to get it back, we needed more capital, so we found another set of partners. And sooner or later, we discovered we were a private equity fund family with multiple funds. And anyway, the whole thing kind of evolved through the 90s. And that's what was most exciting, was being kind of on the front end of what we now look back as creating an industry, not just in energy private equity, but being one of the players in private equity in general, was really quite exciting. In many ways, it was a blur when I think about what was going on in my life at the time. But I wouldn't trade it for anything because it was completely unscripted. And there were times we had to change our business strategy because what we were doing wasn't working. And that was exciting, treacherous. And we can intellectualize it now and kind of look at what we did. But at the time, it was pretty frightening. So I'd say that personal growth, business growth, all of that together was fascinating. And I think doing it at a young age, we didn't have far to fall, and that made it really more palatable. I knew at the end of the day we were taking a bet on ourselves. My partner David Albin and I had a very fortunate circumstance that Richard Rainwater said, "Y'all two need to meet each other," and that was the extent of our job interview with each other. And he was the best business partner anybody could have, and we were partners for 30 years with never a stitch of paper between us. I never once had a disagreement about how we would divide things or how we would go forward. We just figured it out. It was just really special. So to me, it was formative and gosh, it's too hard to pinpoint any single thing. We had some super high highs and some super low lows, and you just got to keep going.
You clearly made a difference, Ken. A lot of our values, the background, the foundation, goes back to when we're growing up. You've talked in the past about your family life. It was a difficult challenge between your mother and your father, and created a lot of pressures within your household. But then you've also talked about how important that was to kind of molding you and kind of giving you a sense of independence and maybe even a drive. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I wrote about that in my book, The Fastest Tortoise, which is still available. I got, as I said, I'll steal a line from Anthony Scaramucci that I've written a best-selling book, and I got the boxes in my basement to prove it. It was a weird. It was my normal. People talk about overcoming hardship, and I had divorced parents that weren't particularly enamored with each other. By the time I came along, I was the youngest of three, and so I don't really have any happy family memories of all of us together. But it was my normal. Mm-hmm. There were other kids around that had divorced parents also, and so I didn't wake up and think, oh my gosh, I've been dealt a raw hand. It was just my hand. And the one thing they did agree on was education. And my mother was an economics professor, and she was a well-decorated economist. And so there was never a doubt about going to school and about going to college and all that stuff. The thing that my parents did agree on was to enroll me at St. Mark's. And when my home life was not nurturing, I dove into everything that I could at school. And a school that was a kind of a first grade to 12th grade experience was real stability. That was my stability. And my friend group were friends I've had since I was 6 or 7 or 8 years old. And teachers that I might have had them in lower school, and then I had them again in middle school, and then they were an advisor later, and they were on the camping trip, and they were a coach, and so these.
That was the consistency.
That was it. And I would say that St. Mark's to me was home, and I ended up, in high school, if you stay late, you end up running things. The person who's, and I just wanted to stay late because I just didn't want to go home. And so I said, when does the debate team work out? Oh, on weekends. I'm like, I'm there. We travel all weekend. I'm there. Oh, the newspaper. What do you guys do? When are you going to do your work? Oh, nights and weekends. I said, I'll sign up for that. And when people left, I'm like, I'll stay and rewrite those articles or retype them. And sooner or later, the person who stays the latest ends up running it. Yeah. And so that's what happened. And it was a phenomenal environment for me. And it was really the stability for me. And that formed the basis of so much confidence that I had to bet on myself and to say, I can do this. And I went away to school and, I did it. And I didn't think anything of it.
Went to Princeton.
Yes.
And at that time said, okay, I never want to be dependent on anyone.
Right. And that's, and that again wasn't like drilled in me. I just knew that I wasn't going to necessarily inherit anything. And so if I needed to make ends meet, it would have to be because I was able to create it. And I started out as a pre-law guy, and I was going to be the next great litigator, and ended up getting involved with the business organization at Princeton, which I really, really liked. And so I said, well, if I'm going to go to law school, that's 3 years. So why not go to get a JD MBA? Because that's 4 years. Mm-hmm. So it's just one more year on top of 3, right? It's only a 30% move. I can do that. And so I ended up applying to both business schools and law schools everywhere. And it was really one of my first market tests. And I got into or waitlisted at virtually all of the business schools, and I got waitlisted or rejected at virtually all of the law schools. And I said, maybe the market, maybe there's a message here. And so I said, well, maybe I'll go to business school first. And then to tack on a JD MBA, I said, wait a minute, business school is 2 years. So to get my law degree, that's 4 years. That's like a double. It's the same 4 years, but if you start with 2, going to 4, it seemed a lot longer than starting at 3 and going to 4. So I completely, kind of retooled and ended up at Morgan Stanley in their 2-year analyst program on my way as I deferred to Stanford Business School. And again, that was just fortuitous. And then they shoved me in the energy group when I was...
And no energy engineering background.
Oh, God, no.
No geology.
God, no. I was
But one of the things you
dangerous
talk about in
liberal
Fortis
arts guy.
was the ability to kind of go into areas that you didn't know anything about in a very disciplined way and build a knowledge base up.
Well, that was probably my gift, is that I didn't have any bias, right? To me, it was a widget. They shoved me in the energy group in 1985, and it happened to be where there was lots of M&A action, a lot of corporate finance action, and so it was trial by fire, and I had to learn. I'd ask people, what does this mean? What does that mean? And so I had nothing to, I was a totally clean slate. And that turned out to be a real gift, because I was learning things at the time they were happening. And this was 1985 to 1987. This is the heyday, just at the Drexel junk bond era, what's happening in the LBO market's just kind of starting. It was a really interesting time in the financial markets. And here I was, a young guy having to run the numbers on it. And I didn't know how to run numbers, so I had to learn. And that to me was a real gift. And so I learned the energy business from an investment standpoint. I still couldn't tell you the difference between, what read a log or a seismic line. But it was I understood. I started to understand, just the financial metrics about valuation, and then worked backwards.
When you left Morgan Stanley then to go on to Stanford, the business school there, was your goal to go into energy, go back into energy? What were your thoughts going into the business
My thoughts
school?
was I do not want to go back to investment banking. And I just remember really vividly seeing the celebratory stuff that happened, the loose sites, the deal toys that showed up on your desk when you were part of a deal team. Like, all I did was run some numbers and put some slides together. I don't know why it matters. But from the investment banking standpoint, they got their fee, they advised their client, the client got their deal done. And I'd look at it and go, how do we know that's a good deal? I mean, we were working on some restructurings that I'm sure 10 years earlier or 5 years earlier, there were deal toys written about putting those companies together. Now they're talking about this company's terrible. They can't make any of their money. And, why did they make that acquisition and that acquisition and that deal? And so there was something in me that just said, this isn't the time to celebrate. But it was very transactional, and it was a transactional business. And that's what Wall Street is. They are transaction advisory, either financings or for mergers or acquisitions. So when I got to Stanford, one thing I said to myself is I really didn't want to go back to that climate. I also looked around and said, are there people here that when I'm 40 to 50 years old, having worked there for 20 to 30 years, do I want to be like them? And there were a lot of really haggard people that were running around, trying to catch trains, not spending a lot of time with their families, not spending a lot of time at home. It was a real grind. And a lot of these folks, to a young guy, I go, man, their life looks like a mess.
Yeah.
And so I said, I just didn't want to sign up for that. So I wanted to have a different kind of experience. And in the finance world, there was this thing starting called principal investing. Today we'd call it private equity, or we'd call it family office management, or we'd call it, I don't know, fundless sponsors. You can get a PhD in that today. At the time, it was just like, there's this thing out there that for people that want to invest money, but aren't stockbrokers, but aren't picking stocks. And so that's how it started. And I called a friend back at Morgan Stanley, and I said, I'm going to do an independent job search, which was code for, I really don't want to sign up for all the investment banker or consulting interviews, although I did do that. And who's out there? And he said, well, you're from Texas. You must know the Bass Brothers. I'm like, I was from Dallas, and they were from Fort Worth. And, there wasn't the internet back then. I'm like, I think I heard of them. But he said, but there's a guy that used to work for the Basses. He ran their money for the Basses, and he left them a couple years ago to go off on his own. His name is Richard Rainwater. So I wrote that down. It's easy to remember. And I said, okay, I'll get in touch with him. And so I called 411 information and I asked for the office of Richard Rainwater. They gave me a number. I dialed the number. Nice woman answers. I said, like to send Mr. Rainwater a letter. What's your address? She said, 201 Main Street, Fort Worth, Texas. I said, great. I wrote a letter. Cold call letter. Stapled my resume to it. Mailed it off. That was it.
And what response did you get back?
Well, I mean, it's really a weird story because I was kind of waiting. I sent the letter. I'm counting, okay, he probably gets it 4 days from now. I don't want to be over eager. Let it sit on there, call him up.
Those were in the days of snail mail, by the way.
Yeah, totally.
Is that how the mail system works?
Different than what
Totally.
you've seen.
Yeah. I forget, 8 cents, 10 cents, what postage cost. And anyway, the phone rang about 4 days later. The phone rang at the house I was renting. And it was a woman's voice on the phone. And she says, Ken Hersh? I said, yes. She says, hold the line for Mr. Rainwater, please. And I swear I thought it was one of my friends gigging me. And so I pick up the phone and I was on the phone and he goes, Rainwater, you want the quote? That was his line. You want the quote? And I thought, is the stock market down? Because this is October 87. This was in March of 88. This has been February of 88. October 87. Out of California, we all woke up. By the time we woke up, the market had crashed.
Right. And real estate market.
Right. Everything. So, when somebody says, you want the quote, I'm thinking, oh crap, the market's down 500 points again. Here we go. And those were trying times at the business school. You can imagine a bunch of former bankers, with their bonus checks, cashed or put in the market while they're waiting for their tuition payments, to be made. But I said, yeah, give me the quote. And I didn't know what he was going to say. And he said, I talked to so-and-so back at Morgan Stanley, and they said, Morgan Stanley invented the analyst program. They've had more analysts than anybody, and you're the best analyst they've ever had. And wow. I was like, wow.
That's high praise.
Yeah.
And he said, sounds like I need to meet you. When can you get here? I said, well, let me work on that. So anyway, I swung an interview with McKinsey a couple days later, and I asked which is also a very brave story. I look at what I did at age 25. If that happened to me today, some kid walked in, I'm going, you're crazy. But I said to the McKinsey interviewer, I said, I'd be kind of interested in your summer program, but I'd like to work in your Dallas office. He goes, really? And he's used to, my classmates had all been in there for 2 days saying either San Francisco office or forget it. Yeah. And I said, I'd like to work in your Dallas office, but I'd like to see it first. It did dawn on him that I was from Dallas. Like, why do you need to see the Dallas office? You're from Dallas. He's like, he was so excited that he said, sure, when do you want to go? And I said, well, I just need a ticket, because he said, great. So we set it up like 2 days later.
Sounds like dual purpose.
Exactly. So so then I called Rainwater back. I said, I got my ticket. I'll be there like next week. And so I interviewed with McKinsey during the day, and I went over to see Richard that afternoon. And that's where I met him.
So what was that conversation like? You're there, you've kind of faked out McKinsey to get you here. What was that conversation like?
That conversation was equally bizarre because I walked in and, Richard's office completely white, looks like an old lab, with gray carpet like you'd find in an exercise room and white desks with white marker boards, floor to ceiling. And on his desk, he had two black phones side by side and nothing on his desk except there was this little blue binder. And he sat there and talked to me for about 5 minutes and he said, well, I really don't have any jobs because I don't have any work for me. We just have these guys around here who are doing deals. But I sound like I just want to meet you. And I'm like, damn it. Yeah, I came all this way and, he tells me he doesn't have any employees and have a summer program. I'm looking for a summer program. I'm looking for benefits. I'm looking for good pay. I'm 25 years old. What the hell? Anyway, so, and then he says, but wait a minute, you were in the energy group, weren't you? At Morgan Stanley. I said, oh yeah, uh-huh. And so he spun this blue book around towards me. And so I picked it up and I flipped through it and it was a McKinsey study. And it was a McKinsey study that was peddled to him by an associate at McKinsey named Jeff Skilling and the head of their energy practice, a guy named John Sawhill, who was Jimmy Carter's undersecretary of energy, who has since passed away. And it was their view of the gas bubble, that supply is doing this and demand is doing this, so prices are going to go from here to here. Real simple, and I had all these, explosions and charts and graphs. And so I'm flipping through it and I knew enough to be dangerous. And again, you got to look at this for the younger audience out there. Please don't do this to me, but I did it. And I had nothing to lose because he just told me he has no summer program, no jobs, So I closed the book. I slapped my hand on. I said, tell you what, Richard, I'm 25 years old. Richard Rainwater. If I had known who he was, I might have been more petrified. I'm like, tell you what, Richard, how about for my summer job, I take the McKinsey view of the world and I put together an investment strategy, who wins, who loses. You paid good money for this McKinsey study, so I won't dispute that. But given that dynamic, how would you put money to work? And he said, right, sounds interesting, make me a proposal. So I wrote up a proposal to spend my summer, not really my summer job, but April and May. This was in March of 88. April and May, plus mid-August to mid-September, because Stanford started so late. I'd do 3 months with him, and I ended up getting this job offer at McKinsey. So I said, great, I'll take my minimum summer at McKinsey. I'll work there June and July and half of August, so I can get the best of all worlds.
So
and
you actually had two different things.
Yes, you did Rainwater and McKinsey that summer.
Yeah, I went out like 3 times the whole night, 3 nights, the whole summer. I moonlit essentially putting this big study together, and that formed the basis of what became Natural Gas Partners in November 16th, 1988.
So you actually started the firm then when you were at Stanford.
Richard made one phone call, and back in the days when fundraising, you needed somebody to make a phone call. He made a phone call, and David Albin, who was working on one of the Bass partnerships that Richard still oversaw, Richard said, y'all two need to meet. And
so he kind of put you together.
He kind of put us together, and Peter Juice said okay, and Peter was Richard's right hand, and the Equitable put up $97.5 million, and they walked $2.5 million around the office, and we had a $100 million fund and no assets and no geologists and no engineers, and we're supposed to put this money to work in energy with an 11% hurdle rate, and the money was wired to us on day one. No just-in-time funding. This was like, boom, we got the check.
So go.
And Gamble Baldwin and John Foster joined us quickly, and from First Boston, and we had our little team together, and we were dangerous looking back on it.
So the McKinsey study says it's going to go like that. What did it do?
It went down for 7 straight years. There wasn't a thing in that McKinsey study other than the paper that was correct.
Now I've got to jump in. Do you know who Jeff Skilling is?
No.
Do you want to tell him or you want me to?
That's an episode by itself.
Enron?
And very good.
Yeah, I was
very good.
Hold on.
Jeff Skilling had a wonderful career at McKinsey, and then he became the number 2 guy to Ken Lay at Enron, and
eventually became CEO.
And he became ultimately CEO and moved the company from a pipeline company to an asset-light trading business, and played the internet, the first internet boom. You're too young to know the 1998, 99, 2001 internet boom that came to a crash and took Enron down with it. And then he ended up going to jail for standing up in a shareholder meeting saying that, he still thinks the stock's, undervalued, and as the stock was going down.
Yeah.
14 which is
years.
A separate story. But really a brilliant guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, there's lots of people, and that
he was actually my graduate school class.
No. Yeah. I mean, was he brilliant then too?
Yeah, no, he was very well thought of. Yeah. I went to a different place, so we had sections upstairs and downstairs. So I was an upstairs, he was a downstairs. So we didn't have much contact, but we said hi every once in a while.
Yeah, but I mean, a brilliant guy, but reality got in the way of his theory. And there's lots of people that have fancy charts and graphs and say this is what ought to happen, but life and reality have a way of creeping.
So how do you run? So the study says prices are going to go up.
Yeah,
so that's the premise.
Well,
prices go up, $97 million turns into more, et cetera.
Exactly.
But then 7 years they go down. So how does $97 million actually start generating what turned out to be a 30% annualized return over decades?
Over the course.
Yeah.
Not a bad return.
Today we would say it was a pivot, which is fancy for failure. But we had actually done 4 or 5 transactions in the first 3 or 4 years from 88 to 92. And a couple of those had done well. And one was sideways and one not good. And so, I'm not that analytic, but I said, well, I only have 4 data points. Why did these 2 work when prices went down? And why did this one not work? Well, because prices went down. Mm-hmm. And so I basically just, again, back to not knowing the technicals was my gift, because we just sat down and said, where did these deals work and why? And they basically worked because we had great management teams who who didn't get sucked into the theory. They were on the ground watching what was happening, and when the world was giving them lemons, they made lemonade. And they averaged in and averaged down, we would say. And they took assets that really were someone else's trash and made it their treasure. And that's when I looked at it and I said, wait a minute, this is not that hard.
So they acquired depleting assets.
Well, they acquired, or they were able to build around old fields and get more out of it than the prior operator. And I really remember this rather vividly. I said, this is not that difficult. The income statement of an oil and gas company is not that different than anything else. It's volume times price, that equals revenue, minus costs. That's it. I tried to find other things. I couldn't. That's it.
That
volume times price.
That was early on at Stanford.
Yeah, this was like, I don't know what this was. I could have done an abacus on this one. Anyway, and then I said, wait a minute. If prices are going to go down all the time, we have volume times price minus cost. I said, if volumes are always going down, well, then just put that in your damn model. Right. Just lower prices 10% a year. Yeah. And what is going to have higher cash flow? It's going to be those companies that can increase volume or decrease costs well enough to offset the price decline.
Yeah.
I said, so why don't we focus on people who know how to increase volumes and decrease costs? Ideally, both of them, but maybe just one. Maybe you can make up in volume what you lose in price. So we ended up gearing our business, again, not being petroleum engineers or geologists or geophysicists looking for volumes, okay? We said, why don't we look for people? Mm-hmm. Why don't we look for those people who love the asset, who love tinkering, who love going back into old fields and finding those undrilled locations, the bypass zones, or they can find the ways to stay on top of their maintenance so the wells don't go down.
Where's shale fracking, et cetera, at this point in time?
Well, fracking existed. I mean, we've been fracking wells in this country for 70 years. We were fracking vertical wells. And we didn't start drilling horizontal until the 2006, 7, 8. We were drilling directional wells, but that to make that turn, that technology didn't really come until the early 2000s. And so that, to me, that was the real, but the shale was in many cases, sometimes the shale was the source rock, or you drilled through it and busted your drill bit, okay, which is the most expensive part of your drill string, and you cursed when you hit the shale, going through it. But that, that was a completely different calculus. I mean, that didn't really exist. What we were doing was basically saying, if we can look at old fields, and old fields may have had a 30% recovery factor. I said, well, you mean there's 70% of the hydrocarbons still down there? I said, again, liberal arts guy, I can do the math. Yeah, 1 minus 0.3 equals 0.7. I said, so you're telling me that there's 70% of the production back down there. What if we were able to get just 5% more recovery factors to go from 30 to 35, right? That could be a lot on the 70% that's left. And so I said, why don't we reorient our business to finding those people? And then we looking at the companies that did well, that's exactly what had happened.
Yeah. So what were the commonalities on those management teams? Did you look for people that were the same ilk? How did that happen?
Well, I mean, we were blessed. We had a few contacts, and we just were taught by those early portfolio companies. But we had a few key principles that were classic rainwater. Align your interests. Make sure they put skin in the game. Don't have it just be that their upside is purely on options. Yeah. Okay, have them invest in the deal with you. And you can ferret out the promoters, the people who say, well, I never went, my daddy told me you never put money in your deal, you never go broke, right? So why don't you put your money in the deal? And so I always said, think of risk like a football in a meeting, okay? And if you're passing the football to me, then I have all the risk, right? So classic oil and gas promoters, you put up all the money and I get a quarter,
right?
Okay? Yeah. Well, where's the risk? It's in my lap.
Right.
Compare that to somebody who says, this is a really awesome deal. I need $20 million, but I only have one. Will you put up 19 with me? Mm-hmm. Now where's the risk? It's right in the middle and we both have our hands on it.
And the one might be worth more to him than the 19.
Exactly. And so if you could find those people who are passionate, who are excited about putting their money in, we were off to the races. Now today, it's so commonplace. And, I used to say back then, our job was to determine what is good from what is bad. Now the job in the investment business is to determine what is good from what sounds good. because you can AI it and say, oh, I'm having a meeting with NGP or with Ken. These are the 5 things he looks for. Okay,
Right.
say them, or do them. But you can tell people who do them reluctantly. I know you're going to ask me how much skin in the game I have, so I'll do $1 million. But your net worth is $50 million. That's if you have $100,000 net worth and you'll put in 90,000. That says a lot to me too.
Yes. Yeah.
So I just, this was easier back then because the universe was smaller, the rule book was smaller. And so we found those people who are passionate and competitive and excited and excitable. And you could tell somebody when they're talking about their business, you can tell people who are excited. If I asked you about your old business, you'd get excited about what you built and how it worked and how it all fit together. You wouldn't say, oh gosh, the drudgery of the people who talked about the drudgery of the good old days. Yeah. It's the people who long for that. And that's what we found. And we really tapped a nerve in the industry at a time when nobody was allocating capital to energy. The people who were allocating it were doing it on debt terms. Show me a bunch of assets, and they themselves had engineers. We had no engineers. We weren't threatening to the management teams. And we would put up equity, and we would say, why don't we share the equity bet with you? You put up your cash, we'll put up our cash, and then we'll fund as we go. And if it doesn't work, we're going to lose our money pro rata, but you're going to sweat it equal to or more than me. And so I can sleep at night because I need you to be the expert because I'm not the expert. And that's what, that was the secret to our success, is that we aligned our interests with people who are money makers and we tried to get out of their way.
And you were doing funding your second year at Stanford then.
Mm-hmm. We started, yeah.
So much like that summer when you had 2 jobs, you had 2 jobs of second year business school plus NGP.
Now David Albin was already out, so we had an office and so we were going, but that's when we got started, and again it was an exciting time. We were making it up as we went along, but we had a few key lessons from Rainwater, and we had capital at a time when there wasn't a lot of capital around. We had a little brochure, and we'd walk into a town and that people would hear we're in town. They'd call the last meeting we're at saying, send them over, And anyway, it was, and being a young guy, I was very non-threatening. I went into people and I read their annual reports and said, tell me why you did that deal last year and what were you thinking 3 or 4 years ago and when you did that and where do you see the company? And they were very, forthright and kind of almost fatherly to me,
Richard was a real investing icon, including this parts, but far beyond this parts too. Talk to him about from a mentorship standpoint.
Well, to see Richard had an electric mind, and he rarely he didn't keep a calculator on his desk. He had a yellow legal pad that he would scribble on as he talked to you and doodle, and so it was all about holding a concept in his head. He was looking for as he would always say, wherever there's chaos, there's opportunity. Mm-hmm. And rather than curse what's going on and say, gosh, I can't believe things are this bad, he'd say, no, it's a gift. And, kind of running into the burning building kind of from investing standpoint. But he was always thinking, he was always making calls. He was not shy. And most importantly, what I saw was how he treated people. He was the ultimate in present. When you were with him, you were the only guy in the room. People would schlep to Fort Worth. He rarely got on an airplane, and they would come from all over, and he would sit there with. I knew because I heard his script over and over again. He had no intention of putting money in that deal, but he made them feel like they were the only people in the room. And he says, "You know what? This deal isn't quite for me," which was code for hell no. And he said, "But you need to meet somebody, or have you thought about doing it this way? What if you sold that off and you keep that whole thing for free? Why do you need money at all?" And he was kind of testing and he was thinking out loud and he got people energized and they would leave and say, thank you. And I'm like, he just told them no. And they're saying, thank you. Yeah. And I had people years later come back and say, oh, Richard said, if I ever have an idea, we're good friends. I've said, really? I said, Richard, remember this person? He's like, maybe, but that charisma, that magnetic electric personality, and he always was helpful. he was always transparent. He'd tell you what he'd have his old balance sheet, give it to you if you wanted it. And he would be, he'd be open, and he'd be the first one to make a phone call and say, Kyle, this doesn't quite fit me, but let me call my friend Tom. He might really like it. Yeah. And you'd say thank you. And even if it didn't work, you'd feel like it was worth your time. And so I always tried to emulate that. Treating with management teams, he would say, Ken, David, whether you own 1% of the company or 99% of the company, you work for them. Don't sit there and tell them what their business is. You backed them because they know the business, because they know those fields better than you will ever know it, which is why we didn't have engineers on staff. What are we going to have an engineer who's a West Texas engineer in the morning and he's a Rocky Mountain engineer in the afternoon? And here comes a team that's lived that field for the last 20 years, and we're going to tell them in an afternoon that their numbers aren't right? I mean, forget it. So we just said there's a different way to do this, and that was Richard's style of investing. And Richard was the ultimate generalist, and we just adopted many of those traits. But it was about aligning interests. We coined the phrase owner manager, and making sure that they put their own skin in the game, but that they then had meaningful upside beyond that after we all got our money back pro rata.
So before we move on to call it the public policy side, talk us through the investment in Energy Transfer Partners. How did that come about? When did you first hear about it? Walk me through the steps.
In the back, in a weird way, to Jeff Skilling, in 2001, Enron was falling apart. The internet was crashing, and these energy trading companies, these pipeline companies that had become energy and electricity trading companies, were falling apart. California power crisis had happened, and I was sharing a golf cart with Ray Davis at an energy golf outing, and said, "Why don't we put some money together to go after some of these assets that are going to be shed by these companies as they go through their financial restructurings?" And he said, "Well, my partner Kelsey and I already have a little company." And I said, "Well, we could use that." And the name of his little company was Energy Transfer. And so to make a long story short, we invested in their company, and we invested in them. And they tough traded me by telling me what they thought the value was that their company was worth, which was probably 4 times what it really was worth. But I said, okay.
And you generated a 3,000% return.
Something like that.
So you don't feel too bad.
Yeah. Well, but that's where the people, what we realized back when we retooled our investment strategy was when we looked at assets. Like when we first started NGP, we had a consultant look over our shoulder, tell us what these assets were worth, and we were focused on the assets. These assets are going to be worth more when prices go up. Well, what we also came to realize was that the depletion is a real word in oil and gas.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
All oil and gas wells deplete.
Mm-hmm.
So 5 years later, 7 years later, when you go to exit that company, the wells you're looking at today are going to be largely depleted. So what you have to sell 7 years from now is what management did with your capital, with our capital, plus the cash flow off those assets. Mm-hmm. So if you're plus or minus 10% on the cash flow of these assets, but your management team is awesome, you'll be fine in year 7. If your management team is mediocre, you could nail the value of those assets and they'll still be depleted in year 7. You dissipated the reinvestment of those cash flows. So the day 1 valuation was a whole lot less relevant to the value in year 7, 8, 9, or 10. It had so much more to do with the business plan, the reinvestment strategy, the skill, the chutzpah, whatever you want to call it, about that team, that they were able to take those dollars and reinvest. So, were they going into an area that had a lot to choose from, where there were lots of things to look at? And in Ray and Kelsey's case, there was. And so, they said, this is what the company's worth. I said, okay. I came back from the meeting and my partners thought I was crazy. You said, what? Company's got like $2 million of cash flow. He says worth 45. I said, they wanted 45 for it. I said, okay.
The rest is history.
Yeah, we put up $37 million. We pulled out about $1.3 billion in 5 years. It was
called it a day.
Yeah. Well, it was more than a day.
Yeah,
it was a day, a night, a decade. I mean, it was, but there was a whole lot of work that went into that Ray and Kelsey did, and their team around them. And we had good fortune on the acquisition side. We had good fortune on the capital market side. We did some nifty trading along the way. with the capital markets and turned it into a dividend play. And it was just incredible.
And again, a lot of those assets at Enron, the hard assets, not soft, but the hard assets, they turned out to be worth an awful lot to a lot of folks.
That's true. Now that we didn't buy any assets from Enron, but the first company was a Kansas-based utility called Aquila, which was the assets that we bought. They were Texas natural gas gathering assets and a intrastate pipeline. The industry was going through restructuring, and there was chaos, and so we had a team, we had cash flow, and we went shopping, and there was a lot to shop for, and we had aggressive shoppers. Kelsey was aggressive and still is an aggressive shopper, and has an incredible nose for value, and that was our mantra. Just be as helpful as we can, be a great financial partner, and get out of their way.
So let's switch gears a little bit. I'm too young to remember kind of the gas shortage in the 70s. And I would say fossil fuels, was probably viewed a little bit differently back when you were starting in GP, back to the 70s, et cetera. I've grown up in the world where renewable energy and fossil fuels, it's bad. And energy gets, I think, a bad moniker. As you've seen the world evolve, how has fossil fuels in the energy space become more of a social issue as well as an economic issue through some of your experience?
I mean, you just used the term fossil fuels and energy interchangeably, and I'd say that the difficult thing is that it took 100 years that we've built an industrial society on the backs of cheap and reliable energy supply. Okay, the moments where we don't have cheap energy, we have inflation. The moments we don't have reliable energy, we don't have an industry, but everybody got used to that. And they lost sight. I think as a society, we started to take for granted all of the hard work that went into building a value chain. Okay, to a point where you're in your car at an intersection, and you get to decide: do I want to fill up my car from that guy over there who's got underground tanks full of refined product, or this guy over here that has underground tanks full of refined product sitting there waiting for you to choose? And you say, no, I'm in the wrong lane. I'll go to this one instead of that one so I don't make a turn. That hydrocarbon may have started in West Africa, okay, in a multi-billion-dollar, multi-decade, risky proposition that came all the way to your corner where it's sitting there waiting for you to fill up, okay? And that inventory risk that was taken by that value chain built the most industrialized, innovative economy in the world that has lifted billions of people out of poverty around the world. Similarly, what do we do when we need electricity in this country? We flip the light switch. But this is not a joke, but it was years and years ago. There was a survey in California about where does power come from, and the number one answer was the wall. Okay, now thankfully in California it wasn't the majority answer. It was just the plurality. Okay, but the image is that the wall somehow generates electricity. That there's a pack of squirrels in there turning a generator. Okay, I mean, but that's what we have come to know. Mm-hmm. That's the entitlement. I get to flip a switch and I get 5 nines of reliability. Well, eventually that chain, okay, has to be paid by somebody. And if you want to layer on domestic, because we've been through the energy independence wave, so I want cheap, I want reliable, and then I'm going to add domestic. That's interesting. Okay, because back until the unconventional shale revolution, the United States energy was finite and in massive decline, to the point where the international companies had to go abroad,
somewhere else,
to find it. Yeah. Then you say, I want clean. Okay, I want cheap, reliable, domestic, and clean. Well, now wait a minute. I can give you domestic and I can give you reliable, but it may not be cheap and it may not be clean. Okay. You want clean, it's not going to be cheap and it may not be reliable, right? Because clean is going to require intermittency. So all of a sudden you add to these equations things that in the real world trade off against each other. Mm-hmm. And I think that people got seduced by the ability for the industry to perform for so long, for so well, and to absorb enormous volatilities, enormous money losses, et cetera, along the way, but yet still provide that energy for a growing economy to a point where you can just pile on more demands. Thank you very much for cheap. Thank you very much for reliable. Now I want it to be domestic because I want to be energy independent. And now I want it to be clean, and that's what's happened.
So how did we allow ourselves though? I mean, I think back of the years that we were talking about, the projections. So Al Gore, late 70s, early 80s, all oil is going to be gone by the year 2000. There will be no more oil. Correct. Then it turned into the climate question. By 2020, it will be a disaster. Nobody will be able to breathe. Islands are gone, et cetera, et cetera. Well, neither one of those have turned out to be the case. And at the same time, now I'm going to flip another part on this. From the United States standpoint, arguably we've had no energy policy for the last 40 or 50 years.
We didn't need one.
We concentrated one.
We don't have a policy on lots of industries that, funnily, in a funny way, the market has a way of working and providing us goods and services. We don't have a construction policy, but yet buildings get built. Imagine that.
Well, but in a somewhat different situation though, from a national security standpoint, with not having one and with all the things that you've talked about, we've shifted reliance into players that, for lack of a better term, let's call them bad actors. I think you've used that term previously. Right. You're looking at oil that we believed at one time would only come from the Middle East, still largely dependent on the Middle East. Players like Russia, those sorts of things. The energy, though, as you pointed out a moment ago, we are so dependent on it. Everything revolves around it. The materials that we've got in our clothes, the ability to move, turn on power, turn on your computer, use your computer. Energy is what makes the world go round.
Right. So how did we get there?
Yeah. Why were all of those predictions? How did we let our predictions get so far off?
Well, because there are too many variables in the equation. And when you try to oversimplify it, I mean, the worst thing the economists ever say is all other things being equal. Well, guess what? All other things aren't equal. Right. Okay. But you can extrapolate everything, but that doesn't create a dynamic model. That creates a static model that you're looking at the extrapolation of current trends. What we always miss is human ingenuity. That's what we always miss. Nobody would have thought.
Arguably American ingenuity?
Starting, yes, but there's human ingenuity with fostered and accelerated by an American capitalist system, okay, that doesn't wait for an industrial policy, okay, to figure it out, and says, is there an opportunity here and how can we do it? Don't underestimate the rule of law and that necessity is the mother of invention. And guess what? Everybody said oil is finite, okay? And the United States is a mature basin. Everything, the lower 48 is in decline. If you want to grow your reserve base, you got to go explore elsewhere. So what did we do? Our big oil companies, they went to West Africa, they went to Falkland Island, they went to places like Venezuela, okay? Well, originally they went to places like Mexico and Saudi Arabia until they got nationalized. Where do you think those countries got their assets originally? Okay?
Aramco's,
yeah,
et cetera.
Exactly. So, but the companies that stayed at home said, wait a minute, maybe we can get more out of these old fields. Remember that 30% number I told you? There's 70% still down there. So the unconventional shale revolution showed up by the combination of hydraulic fracturing that we've been doing for 70 years here and horizontal drilling. When you hydraulically fracture a vertical well, you only can perforate the zones that you pass through with that one vertical well. If you can stay in the zone and fracture stimulate along the horizontal leg, think about how much more reservoir you can intersect. The combination of horizontal drilling was much more of a horizontal drilling play than a fracturing play. The horizontal drilling unlocked it. And by making that corner, and now we're going out 3 miles, 4 miles. I mean, unbelievable.
Yeah.
Okay. That we go down 7,000 feet, but we go out 25,000 feet. I mean, these are ungodly numbers. And so the productivity that we're able to get, and then you have multiple zones. And so you can have 2 wells on the surface that look like you got 2 straws in the same glass. But one's going down 6,000 feet, one's going down 8,000 feet. They could be 100 million geologic years apart. Yeah. But up on the surface, they look like they're right bumping up against each other. So what happened is that on the supply side, prices went up, and that created the incentive to try new things. And when prices went up in the early 2000s, because we were so short, and China's growing and everybody's growing, the independent oil and gas producer in the United States said, wait a minute, let's try a couple different things. Let's try some different fracks and some different drilling technologies. And people like George Mitchell said, I got it. And it happened 35 miles from where we're sitting right here. And it changed the world. It liberated our foreign policy. It changed our economics. And all of a sudden, the United States was no longer in decline. Yeah. At the time, we were at 5 million barrels a day. Today, we're 13 million barrels a day. We're the largest oil producer in the world. The largest. We're larger than Russia is today. Okay, so we've actually neutralized the reliance on those countries. So you can go industry by industry by industry and say it might be Moore's Law that says, Moore's Law now is a standard thing, but there was no Moore's Law in energy. Oh, we're going to keep finding more and more energy from finite resources. Really? But we in other sectors, we take the technological innovation factor and say it's going to happen. We don't know where or how, but it's going to happen. And that's what we need. That's what we need to do around climate adaptation. We need to say, you know what? We've spent $15 trillion as a planet in the last 20 years on renewable energy.
And the effect has been?
Fossil fuels have gone from 84% of global demand to 82%. Congratulations. Okay, now it may have been higher, okay, but the world, over that time period, the world's gone from 6 billion people to 8 billion people.
And where's that 15 trillion been spent, Ken?
Solar and wind, primarily.
By what countries?
The United States, China, Europe.
And what percentage of emissions come from those countries?
The United States is such a non-event right now. I mean, people look at we beat ourselves up back to what the youth is looking at. I don't know what they're looking at. Okay. I wish they would do math. Okay. The United States, our emissions today are equal to 1979 emissions. Okay. We're the only country that have met the...
And still kind of 14, 15% of the world?
About 13%. Very good, Tom. You're on your numbers. We're 13% of the world. Okay. Emissions. Okay. If we cut our emissions in half, never mind that our economy would collapse and our industry would collapse, et cetera, the lights would go dark half the time. But let's say, for argument's sake, in 10 years, we could reduce our emissions by 50%. Okay. That's 1/2 of 1% a year globally. It would be offset by the growth in China you'd never even see. Well, that's the kind of thing.
And that's the piece. You still have a new coal plant. A couple of years ago, is at least one a day. I'm not sure what the number is today.
But not one a day, but 1 or 2 a week.
In China.
Yeah.
India following.
Right.
Again, feeling that they're actually owed the opportunity to use that cheap energy to build an economy, much as we did 50 to 100 years ago.
That's right. And so what I have been pounding the table on is to say we should not be the generation that says going back to the buggy whip is the smart thing to do. Okay. We should be the generation saying we need to leapfrog this. We should be spending money on R&D for leapfrog energy technologies instead of these tiny little minor things that have such a small base to start with, like solar and wind, that really aren't going to make that big of a difference in the time period, if you believe the models. Because what's happened, it has nothing to do with energy. The world's population has gone from 6 billion people to 8 billion people, and it's on its way to 9. Right. Okay, it took 10,000 years to get to 100 million people on this planet, and then it's taken 200 years to get to 8 billion. I mean, this is ridiculous. And to think of it, it's as an energy problem. And so at the same time, we have 2 billion more people wanting to live middle-class lifestyles around the world with gadgets and everything else in the world. So if you combine that with where human beings have settled, we have about 1/3 of the world's GDP located within 25 miles of of coastlines, not just in the U.S., all over the world, right? So if the 20-year storm, if the 100-year storm is now the 20-year storm, why don't we spend some of the trillions and trillions of dollars in fortifying our populations so that they don't have to get up and move, right? Because when populations have to get up and move because of drought or because the areas become uninhabitable, that's when machetes come out. And that's that to me is the real crime on these models, that it's been not a waste. It has cost us time. Yeah. And if you believe the models, the one thing we don't have is time. So I can buy us, you want to debate getting to the year 2100? How about get to the year 2050 so we can see the year 2100? And if we're sitting around futzing around with solar panels, or dealing or trying to bankrupt the, economies by trying to turn back the clock on energy, I'd rather have cheap, plentiful energy and let people live and innovate instead of having to try to make sustenance.
And I think everybody at this point, not everybody, but clearly governments, large think tanks have given up on the idea, the Paris Accords, that we're going to hit the achievable numbers and that sort of thing. But yet people are still calling for, I know several years ago, 6 trillion. Most McKinsey studies probably today are at 9 trillion is the dollars that are needed. It seems where the conversation hasn't been, and you touched on it a moment ago, Ken, is what are the alternative investments? E.g., how could you use that money to clean up existing energies, and or is there a way that actually produces more benefit? E.g., take 1 trillion of that and end hunger in Africa.
Right. Well, you've just answered your own question. I mean, I think the answer is yes. There's a lot better ways to spend the money where you can make a big enough difference. So the first thing you want to do, I mean, the analogy I like to draw, again, this is a liberal arts guy with an MBA doing this, is if the three of us said we're going to go tackle global health, okay, let's make the biggest, most bold difference we can in global health. The first thing we would do is we'd look up what are the primary causes of death. Cancer, heart disease, right? You'd say, all right, if we can hit cancer and heart disease, we can really make a dent.
Win the game.
Right? What if I said, no, let's start at the top of the head. Let's start there and work our way down. We'll get to the heart later, but let's start with hair follicles. You'd laugh, okay? Because it's nonsensical. You want to start with the biggest stuff first. So if you want to solve emissions, the only thing you should focus on is Chinese coal, followed by Indian coal and U.S. coal. That's it. Now, the market has already solved U.S. coal. U.S. coal has gone from 50% of electric generation down to 15%. Okay, we've cut our coal tonnage assumption or consumption down by about 40%, and it's going lower. Yet, last year was the number one year of coal tonnage burning on the planet Earth in human history. Last year, okay? It's going to be beat this year, despite China spending a fortune on renewable power, because simultaneously with their spending, they're burning more coal. Right. So, and Mother Nature doesn't know the difference between a U.S. coal ton and a Chinese coal ton. However, the scrubbers and the technologies that we put on our tonnage is way healthier than what others do.
So why is this not known? Why is the public narrative opposite?
Because you know what? I think the environment is the perfect political issue. Perfect. Because I can wrap myself in the clean banner, and I can make my opponent, if I can be cleaner, he or she can be dirty, right? And so we debate who's cleaner, who's cleaner.
Versus bad.
Yeah.
And then what? What does it mean? Money. I get more money for my projects. And guess what? When will we know if I'm right or wrong? 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, I'll be long gone. How perfect can that be? I can accumulate all this goodwill, and it's noble. I'm not for as an oil and gas guy, I'm not for a bad environment at all. Okay? Not at all. In fact, we were really diligent in our companies to make sure that we were as clean and on rules that were voluntary. Okay? The U.S. has done an awesome job. I mean, the U.S. consumes a quarter of the world's energy, and we produce 13% of the world's emissions. I mean, it's stunning how good we are with what we do here. Okay? And we're the only country to meet the Kyoto Accords, and we didn't sign the damn treaty. Okay? What worked? The market worked. And natural gas was a perfect bridge fuel, okay, to get us to that leapfrog technologies, right? And so there is so much natural gas in the world. Gosh, the first thing I would do is I would tell China, hey, look, we'll gift you natural gas power plants. We'll gift them to you.
But on Tuesday, natural gas is a dirty energy, and on Wednesday, it's a clean energy.
Right.
Which one is it?
Clean. It's clean. Now, is it perfect? No. But, eating beef isn't perfect either, right? But I mean, everything in moderation, right? And so natural gas is a wonderful, wonderful fuel to get us from A to B. Wonderful.
So,
and
where's the role of nuclear?
Nuclear, unfortunately, nuclear is one of those things that is super clean, but it got tagged as dirty. Yeah. And now the narrative is starting to change that nuclear is clean, okay? Because now it can fuel technology, right? Now all of a sudden the data center world wakes up and says, we need 5 nines. We need 5 nines of reliability, and nuclear can provide that.
But have we built such a structural impediment in, e.g., regulatory time, costs, those sorts of things? Last nuclear plant that was open was in the Carolinas, estimated to be $6 to $8 billion, came in at over $40 billion.
Right. But we haven't had the technical innovation there because we gutted the industry. We built 100 power plants in this country from 1960 to 1980. Okay, 100 to provide about 20% of the power in this country with 5 nines of reliability. Okay. So, but we've also gutted nuclear engineering programs. If we had been building and sustaining industry, we would have the learning curve, and the prices would have come down.
The people to actually push it. You get outside the Navy, you don't have anybody that's really qualified anymore.
Correct. So it ran through the government, and then that's a very inefficient way to do it. So, I mean, I think that I'm very hopeful that, and I think nuclear. I've always said nuclear is the ultimate answer for electricity. You look at Europe. I mean, France
75%.
France, and 100 miles away are Germans' power plants, and all of a sudden they're dirty, right? They're dirty, and we're going to rely upon Russian natural gas, and look what that got them. So, I mean, energy is a really, really complicated story, but at the end of the day, you got to keep innovation up. You got to keep people working at it, and keep your eye on the prize of what you really want. What you want is cheap, reliable, clean. Okay, and technology will give you a diffuse supply portfolio, and that's the best way to remove your reliance on any one party. Is to have, just like any other business, is to have multiple vendors. Yep. This is no different. Even a liberal arts guy can figure this one out.
Multiple vendors and some fair distribution of information. You've talked before about electric vehicles, excuse me. And that works great as long as you don't talk about the mining and the batteries and the eventual disposal and those sorts of things.
Correct.
When you do that,
it cancels out virtually all the economic and environmental benefit. And I mean, today you have 3 countries that provide about 30% of oil. I'm sorry, you have about 20 companies that provide a third of the oil market. 20 countries. In rare earths, which is the backbone of our electric vehicle market, you have one country that has 80% of the critical minerals and the processing thereof, and that's it. And it's we're trading off a reliance, and this is not, this is just not smart business. And so you have a soup to nuts industry when you take from the mining all the way through disposal, something that isn't necessarily cleaner than fossil fuels. It's more concentrated from a supply standpoint, critical minerals into a single country, with things that are not substitutable. I mean, 80% of the graphite in the world comes from China, and there is no substitute to graphite in the electric vehicle chain. So what do we do about that, right? And we're witnessing it now, where China says, as part of the retaliation, forget the economic numbers. You want to put a big tariff on us? We'll just put no rare earths, no basic, those things. It's not that big, but it's critical, right? It's measured in billions of dollars, not hundreds and hundreds of billions, but it's that one element that we can't do without. And so they know that we have to come to the table.
I come back to the same point of lack of a policy, because that really harkens back, it sounds like, to our reliance back in the 70s of the Middle East on oil.
But at the time, it was lack of forethought. If you said we're going to have a full-on rare earths exploration program in Mexico, U.S., and Canada, this stuff comes out of the Earth's crust. There's lots of Earth's crust everywhere. Okay, We got lots of Earth's crust.
It's really the refining capacity.
It's the refining capacity.
The refining capacity in China is where it is. Exactly.
Right, because you want to put it close to market. Yeah. Well, they were subsidizing the heck out of their solar and batteries, and so they needed the refinery right there, and it was part of their value chain. You could unwind it for money. It just takes money, but these things are pretty dirty to look at.
Exactly. A willingness to be able to do some of these things.
Right.
So we've kind of closed our eyes and we
got lots of rare earths in places like Arizona, Utah, and Nevada. If we want to open up the dirt, we can.
Start going.
And we will have to. Yeah. If we're serious about that, we will have to. I mean, but that's just a different equation. Unfortunately, the math doesn't work there either. If we wanted to shift over, the 250 million cars and internal combustion engine cars and light trucks and turn them over to electric, it's trillions of dollars a grid. It would increase our electricity consumption by 50% over what we have. I mean, just the math doesn't work.
Well, it's a billion, 1 billion, 2 combustible engines out there in the world today.
In the world, 1.2, 25 million electric vehicles. Yeah. I mean, I think if you want to drive an electric vehicle, they are really cool cars to drive. Please go drive one because they're cool and they're fun. Don't drive one because you think you're changing the climate. And for an American to do that, Americans, you've already changed the climate. We've already done it. We're down to 1979 levels of emissions, yet our population's gone from 200 and something million to 340 million. And think about how many more gadgets and stuff we now need to power. We have done a phenomenal job without an industrial policy. We've done it with sheer economic motivation.
So let's talk about your time at the Bush Center. So you, I think, just left the Bush Center. I think there's
not yet, but
close. You're in
September,
process.
Yeah.
You replaced former Education Secretary Margaret Spellings. If my memory serves me. Talk to me about that phone call. How did that conversation first start with the president?
Margaret said she was leaving, and at the time I was working on going to chairman at NGP and thinking about the next chapter of my life. So it actually just hit very at the right time. And I've known President Bush since the late 90s, back when I can call him by his first name. And along with Don Evans, who ran an oil and gas company in Midland, and I was calling on him as a young guy. And so it was at a holiday party, and I was mouthing off to one of the board members and said, the next person you find really ought to stick, because as a donor, I was a donor of the place. It sure doesn't look like you have your act together. The building's been open 3 years, and the next president, CEO, will be the third one you've had. And that's not fair to the president. And, when you say something, and if it was a bubble, you'd want to pull it back. And that's kind of what happened. And lo and behold, after the first of the year in 2016, I called Don Evans. I said, I got a crazy idea for you. And he said, that's not so crazy. And then I went and saw President Bush and met some of the other board members who I'd known socially around town. And it has been, the last 9 years have been just an absolute joy. I mean, people often say, there's been honor and privilege. This job has been an honor and a privilege. And to help support President and Mrs. Bush in what they want their post-presidency to look like around values, freedom, and opportunity, accountability, compassion. These mean something to their public service. And the Bush Center is a home for those values. And the Bush Institute is a place where we put out policy work supporting those values. And, President Bush said, I don't want this to be about me. Go make it not about me. I said, well, that's a neat trick. Your name's on the door. Your wife's on the board. Your best friend's chair of the board. You own all the stock of the company. You have an office there. Now go make it not about me. Okay, good. Now you go run that company. Anyway, but that's how it came about, and it's been just a real joy to try to put in place a plan to make it live long beyond their lifetime.
So, what were the big components when you walked in the door? What kind of major priorities, objectives you have, and where do you stand today, 9 years later?
Yeah, I mean, it's I just did my liberal arts with an MBA analysis, and I said, well, we got to make it last forever. So therefore, everything we do should benefit from, but not rely upon them showing up, because they will not show up forever. Mm-hmm. We need to always make sure we're true to their values. Okay. We need to have our own thought leadership. The Bush Institute needs to have its own experts, its own people that are talking and writing and speaking and are in demand. We need to be talking about issues that are presidential. We can't be playing small ball. We need to have programming that is interesting, that is only at the Bush Center, that is strategically designed, that's repeatable, that doesn't need an invitation to come from President and Mrs. Bush or to get people there. And then we need to have a lot of constituent engagement, and then we need to be sustainable financially. So those were the things. And we had to retrain our audiences so that they would come and hear something really interesting. The Bushes may not be speaking, but they may be elbow to elbow with the Bushes and learning about something interesting and listening to real experts or being challenged in this market. And now we do it online, obviously, to really have something that's presidential in nature, because there's so few of these presidential centers that have an independent think tank attached. And then to put together a constituent engagement plan and a financing plan to build an endowment while keeping our expenses pretty flat
And that's a relatively new structure, Ken, in the sense of you've got an institute, you've got the museum and the library all pulled together.
Right.
Now, President Obama has looked at that and is going to do the same sort of thing.
Right.
But that wasn't kind of the model in the past.
Right. The models really were to be the presidential foundations were much more of a support organization for the museum, and the museum was owned and operated by the National Archives. And when I showed up at the Bush Center, our museum was owned and operated by the National Archives. It took me 5 years, but we got control of the museum. And so now the National Archives manages the archives, which it should. It should manage the documents of the Bush administration. But the museum, the public facing, the institute, I was able to pull it all together and create, the house that integrates now, and we're able to have programming where the museum and the public programming are symbiotic with the institute and the think tank world work that we do, and once that happened, we were able to fundraise around it and to really make sure that we built an endowment out, and we've had such an incredible reception. It's just to watch the community rally around this is a very important asset for not just North Texas, but for the country, has been so gratifying. So I didn't go out and raise money. I went out and told our story, and I told it to thousands of people. And if you tell it to thousands, there'll be hundreds who say, "How can I help?" And of the hundreds, there'll be 50 or 75, or they'll say, "How can I really help?" And then there'll be 5 or 10 who say, "How can I really, really help?" And you just say, "Well, here's what we're trying to do." And it's just been incredibly amazing to see the support.
But changing that structure and coming at it from a very different approach, that gives a degrees of freedom that I'm not sure they were there. I mean, that
Totally.
Looking back, that's 10, 15 years from now, I think that's going to be what people look at and say, you really made a difference.
Well, and we're fortunate that the people that came before me, stood up an independent foundation and the Bush Institute, and with its own governing board. The SMU has permanent seats on the board, but it's not a special voting. It's just one of a number of board members. So we have our own independent board. We can determine what we want to work on. And the Bushes are, wonderful cheerleaders, and they set the tone. I mean, we know the priorities of what President Bush wants to talk about. He wants to talk about economic opportunity. He wants to talk about education. He wants to talk about immigration reform, taking care of our veterans. He wants to talk about strengthening our institutions. And he wants to talk about America as a force for good in the world. Okay, we may not always get it right, but if you want to know what it's like for the U.S. to be in retreat, see who fills the vacuum, right? So I can prove the negative. And
are you concerned about that today, Ken?
I am very concerned about that.
You got a situation where, in a lot of cases, those institutions that you talked about, where the United States was the leader, all of a sudden we're either turning our back on the institutions or we're pushing our allies away.
That's right. Look, protectionism, isolationism, nativism, populism, they do not have a good track record. You would not invest in anybody supporting those doctrines, okay? Case closed. And they are misguided and in many cases dangerous, and they're historically proven. Yet, about every 50 to 100 years, everybody trots them out and says, let's try it again. And I get it. You want to change the status quo? Let's change the status quo. You go 180 degrees from where you are today. You know what? I get that. But at the end of the day, the babies are getting thrown out with the bathwater, and you can prove the negative. In this case, you can say, historically, this is what has happened when the U.S. is withdrawn. This is what happened when the U.S. trade policy changes. These are the things that happen when the U.S. turns inward, and we're going to run that play again.
The story doesn't turn out well.
Do you feel like we're running in some of the similarities of, call it, the 1920s, 1930s, kind of in between the two world wars? That
was the last time it was tried. Right. But there have been other times in history where it's been tried. Yeah. And, it just doesn't end well. Yeah. So I'm going to be one of those voices out there saying, stop. And there's a level of decency, there's a level of morality, there's a level of freedom loving that the United States stands for. And, I don't get it. I don't get xenophobia when we are a country that was built on immigration. Okay. And we weren't always the best immigrants. We were not always the most welcoming.
Oh, back to the late 1800s.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, our borders have been open and closed and open and closed. Mm-hmm. We interned the Japanese Americans. We turned on our own citizens. These are things that are not good on the report card of this country, but yet we continue to do them. So I think that's just human nature. I think human beings are destined to repeat history, and that's just the fact. But yet it's incumbent upon people who understand the facts to say time out.
You're thoughtful. You provide insights. You have created, as an entrepreneur, and then built up a very successful company. You've gone into public service with the work that you've done at the Bush Center, and you're still young. What's next?
I have no idea. I wrote in my book that the fog of the future has always excited me. And I tell young people today, do not overthink it. Do not overscript it. People who say, I'm 28 years old, this is what I want to do by the time I'm 38 and then 48. If you know exactly what you're going to do, then what you really are kind of doing without knowing it is closing off opportunities. If you're so focused on going from point A to point B to point C to point D, you don't know what number 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 is going to hit you and what door may open because you're so fixated on your direction. And so I tell people, don't overthink it. You might know where the next thing is, but don't let it be cloudy. Directionally, yeah, I want to go in that direction, but I don't want to be so scripted that I close off opportunities. So I don't know, but I'm going to just hang out and think about it.
I'll be an investor that says it turns out pretty well. Thanks for being with us, Ken.
Thank you, guys.
Ken, thank you.